I was halfway through buttering a dinner roll when my phone buzzed. A text lit up the screen. Unknown number, 6 words, get up and go. Now, I froze. My son's laughter rolled across the table. He didn't notice me staring at the glow in my hand, or the way my grip tightened on the knife. 71 years of showing up for this family, paying bills, fixing roofs, sitting through every school play and scraped knee. And now a stranger was telling me to leave without a word. The roast on my plate had gone cold. Its steam had vanished, like my place at this table. I glanced around the dining room. Candles flickered against the pale walls, catching on framed photos where my smile still lived. But tonight, my chair felt smaller, like it might vanish under me if I didn't move. My thoughts tangled. Who sends a message like that? Was it a prank? A warning? And why couldn't I shake the sense that it was meant to save me? Dad, you're quiet, my son said, still grinning at his wife. Her eyes barely flicked to me before dropping back to her wine. I thought of last winter, of shoveling their driveway while they sipped cocoa inside. My hands numb, back aching. Not a word of thanks, not even a nod. Just a half-empty mug left on the porch. Now, the air in here was thick with rosemary and unspoken things. Every bite of bread tasted like cardboard. My phone buzzed again. Same number. Don't say anything to your son. I swallowed hard. The words pressed on my chest. Who knew enough to warn me, and from what? Somewhere in my gut, a door creaked open, and I didn't like what I saw inside. I thought about my father's watch, still in my dresser, still ticking after 60 years. He'd told me once, if a man warns you to run, you don't stop to tie your shoes. But walking out now would be admitting something was wrong. And folks, pride is a stubborn thing, especially when you've already been made to feel invisible. I glanced at the hallway, coats on hooks, keys in a bowl. Every path out of this room looked too short, too easy. Everything all right? My son asked, his fork pausing midair. I forced a smile. Just a message from an old friend. Not a lie, if you count the truth hiding behind it. Inside, though, the questions were stacking fast, like dishes after a meal no one enjoyed. Who sent that text? Why tonight, after years of silence between us? And why did I feel certain that staying seated might cost me more than my appetite? The candles guttered as a draft slipped through the room. I caught the scent of rain on the air, sharp, metallic, restless. My phone buzzed a third time. 4 words now, they're about to start. My hand trembled just enough to tilt the wine in my glass. Red streaked across the white tablecloth, a blooming reminder that some stains never wash out. I set down the glass, heart pounding, and I realized I wasn't afraid of leaving. I was afraid of finding out what would happen if I didn't. So, dear listener, what would you do? Stand up and walk away, or sit still and wait for the truth to find you? The rain had started by the time I reached my porch, soft at first, then sharper. Needles against the back of my neck. I fumbled with the key, more from the weight in my chest than the cold in my hands. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and dust, the kind of scent that belongs to places where nothing has moved in too long. I hung my coat on the same hook Margaret used to claim. Her wool scarves had once crowded this space, bright colors softening the edges of winter. I kicked off my shoes and let them fall where they landed. The silence wrapped around me, not gentle, but heavy, like a quilt left too long in storage. On the kitchen table sat an envelope I hadn't opened. No return address, just my name written in my son's hurried slant. I brushed my fingers over the paper, thinking of the last letter he'd sent me. A Father's Day card Margaret had picked out and signed for him. I didn't open it now. Some truths need to wait until the air is steady. The hum of the refrigerator filled the space. I leaned against the counter, eyes catching on the dent in the wood where Rick, at 8, had dropped his baseball glove and sent a jar of pickles rolling to the floor. He'd looked up at me then, lip trembling, afraid of trouble but unable to lie about it. We'd cleaned it up together, laughing when the brine splashed our socks. I could still hear that laughter if I tried hard enough. The kettle sat by the stove waiting. I filled it, struck a match, and watched the blue flame lick the metal. Steam would come soon, but it wouldn't fill the empty chair across from mine. I remembered nights when Margaret worked the late shift. Rick and I would eat grilled cheese on the couch, crumbs on the cushions, a movie we'd both seen 100 times playing low. He'd fall asleep before the ending, head heavy against my arm, trusting me to carry him upstairs without waking him. Somewhere between then and now, the boy who once trusted me with his sleep had learned to keep his eyes open and his hands closed around things that weren't his. The kettle whistled high and sharp. I poured the water, watching the tea leaves swirl and darken the cup. The warmth seeped into my palms but couldn't touch the chill in my bones. Outside, rain tapped the windows in uneven rhythm. It felt like the house was trying to speak, to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. And maybe that was the truth. Maybe I'd been avoiding what tonight had begun to make clear. I carried the mug into the living room, the heat trailing faint wisps into the dim air. The armchair creaked under my weight, the same sound it had made for years. A small, faithful complaint. On the mantel, the framed photo from Rick's college graduation leaned slightly forward. Margaret had worn her best hat that day, the one she saved for church and proud moments. I'd stood beside her, arm around her waist, thinking our son's life was opening into something solid, something good. I took a slow sip. The tea was strong, almost bitter. It suited the night. A clock ticked from the hallway, each second louder than it should have been. I thought of the hours spent working double shifts, saving for his tuition, patching our roof myself instead of hiring help. Every sacrifice had felt worth it. Back then, I believed he saw it too. Rainwater streaked the glass, blurring the streetlights outside. Somewhere down the block, a car door slammed, its echo lingering in the quiet. It was the kind of night that made you listen harder than you wanted to. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, and rubbed the bridge of my nose. Margaret's voice came back to me, her gentle warning not to lose myself in worry. Boys grow up, but they don't always grow wise, she used to say. The floorboards settled with a soft groan. I glanced toward the hallway. Old houses have a way of sounding alive, but tonight it set my nerves on edge. The envelope on the kitchen table waited, its paper catching a sliver of light from the street lamp. I rose, the tea still warm in my hand, and walked back into the kitchen. My fingers hesitated at the seal. For a moment I almost tore it open, almost invited whatever words lay inside to change the night. Instead, I slid it into the drawer by the sink. Not yet. As I closed the drawer, something shifted in my chest. A faint pressure, like a storm building far off but moving closer. The phone on the counter buzzed once, a low vibration against the wood. No name, just a number I didn't know. I stared at it until the screen went dark. The rain kept falling, and somewhere in that steady rhythm, I felt the first crack of something breaking open. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the air heavy with the smell of wet leaves. I pulled on my old jacket, the one with frayed cuffs Margaret kept patching over the years, and headed toward Rick's house. His street was lined with trimmed hedges and driveways that gleamed like showroom floors. My boots left faint prints on the damp pavement. I told myself I was here for coffee for family, but a knot had already formed low in my stomach. Maria opened the door before I could knock. "Morning, Mr. Carter," she said softly, stepping aside. The warmth inside hit me like a wave, fresh bread, polished wood, and the faint tang of cleaning products. I found Rick in the kitchen, his shirt pressed, hair styled just so. Emma stood by the counter, a glass of something green in her hand, her phone angled just right to catch her reflection in the marble backsplash. "Dad," Rick said, smiling too brightly. "Emma's trying out a new juice cleanse. Says it keeps her looking young." Emma didn't look up. She sipped, then set the glass down with a click. "Some of us," she said, "make an effort." The words hung there, not loud, not sharp, but pointed enough to find their mark. Rick's smile faltered, and my ears filled with the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I pulled out a chair at the small breakfast table. The cushion was new, expensive fabric under my hand. Emma finally turned toward me, her gaze traveling over my jacket, my boots still damp from the walk. "You must have been up early," she said. "Some people your age prefer to take it slow." The tone was sugar. The message was not. I kept my face neutral, but inside something shifted. A slow grind, like ice breaking on a winter lake. Rick busied himself with the coffee maker, metal clinking against ceramic. Emma picked up her phone again, her thumbs moving fast. I caught a glimpse of the screen. A group chat, my name in a sentence I couldn't fully read. "Coffee's ready," Rick said, setting a mug in front of me. Steam rose, curling into the light. The smell was strong, familiar, but my appetite for it had vanished. We talked, if you could call it that. About the weather, about a neighbor's new dog. But under it all, the earlier words stayed, like a splinter you can't see but feel with every move. Emma laughed suddenly at something on her phone. "Sorry," she said, not sounding sorry at all, just a joke from a friend. You wouldn't get it. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the heat burn the back of my throat. Margaret's voice came to me again, that soft warning. People will tell you who they are, if you listen closely. And now, I was listening. The silence between sips grew longer. Emma leaned one elbow on the counter, her eyes sweeping the room like she was checking for dust. You know, she said, Rick and I were talking about how much space you have in that old house. It must feel empty. She smiled as if it were a casual observation, but the words landed with the weight of a verdict. I set my mug down slowly, the ceramic making a muted tap against the table. Rick shifted in his seat, pretending to adjust his shirt cuff. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. The kitchen light above us buzzed faintly, casting a pale halo over the polished marble. I could smell the faint tang of lemon polish, stronger now than the coffee. Somehow it made the room feel colder. Emma went on. You could sell it, you know? Move somewhere easier, closer to us. We'd help you manage things. Manage. The word lodged in my mind like a splinter. I thought of Margaret planting roses in our backyard, her knees dirty from soil, her voice telling me that roots, once deep, don't like to be moved. I traced a finger along the rim of my cup. Manage things. I repeated. My tone was light, but my chest felt tight. Rick finally spoke. It's just that the upkeep must be a lot for you now. We're only thinking about what's best. What's best? For whom? I wondered. But I kept my voice calm. You've been thinking a lot about me lately. Emma's lips curved in a polite smile. Family looks out for each other. She took another sip of her green drink, leaving a faint lipstick mark on the glass. Her gaze didn't soften. The clock on the wall ticked, steady and loud, measuring out the moments between what was said and what was meant. I let the quiet stretch. Let them feel it. Maria reappeared to clear the table, her hands moving quickly, her eyes flicking to me for just a second. A flicker of something like understanding. I stood, thanking her, then pushed in my chair. The scrape of wood against tile sounded sharper than it should. Well, I said, you've given me a lot to think about. Emma's brows lifted. Oh, I didn't mean to make you feel pressured. Of course not, I said, and smiled in a way that wasn't a smile at all. The air outside was cool, still damp from last night's rain. I walked slowly down their driveway, each step measured. The echo of their words followed me home. Margaret's roses would be blooming soon. And I knew, as sure as those buds would open, that something had shifted today. Rick called the next afternoon. Dad, can you stop by my office? I've got something simple for you to look over. His tone was light, but clipped, like he wanted to make it sound casual without actually feeling casual. The building was new glass and steel, sunlight bouncing hard off every surface. Inside, the air smelled faintly of fresh paint and some expensive cologne. His receptionist offered me coffee, but my gut told me not to linger. Rick's office was too big for the work he claimed to do. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a leather sofa that looked untouched, and a desk so polished I could see my reflection in it. Glad you came, he said, gesturing to a chair across from him. On the desk, a manila folder sat alone, its flap slightly open like a mouth about to speak. He slid it toward me. Just a few forms, nothing major. Helps me take care of some routine stuff for you. Bill payments, property taxes, keeps things simple. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I let my hand rest on the folder, feeling the weight of the papers inside. What kind of routine stuff needs my signature? I asked. Rick leaned back. Dad, you know you've been busy. Why not let me handle a few things? Less stress for you. Through the glass wall behind him, I could see the skyline, sharp lines cutting into a pale winter sky. It made me think of contracts and cold deals. I flipped the folder open. The top page wasn't about taxes. It was a bank authorization form. My bank. I read the fine print slowly, the words tightening around my chest. Full account accessed. Power to transfer. No expiration. Rick's voice broke into my focus. Dad, it's just so I can move money around if there's an emergency. You trust me, right? A trust. That word again. It sounded different now. Like a test I was supposed to fail. I set the papers down. There's already an emergency line on my account. Why would I need this? His jaw tightened, but he forced a laugh. Banks make everything complicated. This just skips the red tape. The room felt warmer. I could hear the faint hum of the HVAC, the click of his pen against the desk. Too quick, too rehearsed. I pulled the next page free. A withdrawal slip. Already filled in for 5 figures. The signature line blank, waiting for my hand. Is this part of your routine too? I asked quietly. Rick's smile didn't reach his eyes. Just a placeholder. For when you need me to act fast. I closed the folder, sliding it back across the desk. Then it can wait. For a beat, he didn't move. The only sound was the distant murmur of voices from the hall. Finally, he pushed the folder aside. Swit yourself, Dad. I'm only trying to help. But his eyes told another story. One where my signature was a prize he intended to win, no matter how long it took. Rick didn't flinch for long. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, his voice suddenly softer. Dad, you know I wouldn't do anything to hurt you. I'm just trying to make life easier. Remember when you helped me buy my first car? This is the same thing, just in reverse. He was reaching for history, for the part of me that wanted to believe my son still valued trust over convenience. But the folder sat between us like a silent witness. I appreciate the thought, I said, standing, but I'm managing fine. His smile returned too quick, like it had been waiting offstage. Of course. You've always been stubborn. I'll keep these here in case you change your mind. The walk to the elevator felt longer than it should. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon polish, each step echoing against marble floors. Behind me, his office door closed with a muted click, not a slam, but a seal. Outside, the January air bit at my face. I crossed the street to a cafe I knew well. Inside, the smell of roasted beans and baked bread wrapped around me like a safer time. The hum of conversation, the hiss of the espresso machine, small sounds that anchored me. I ordered black coffee, took a corner seat and pulled out my phone. Habit led me to the banking app. The screen lit up with balances I knew by heart, except one was wrong. The restaurant account, the one Margaret and I had built over decades of sweat and sacrifice, was lighter by $8,000. A withdrawal 2 days ago. Authorized in branch. I scrawled down. The signature on the digital slip wasn't mine. It was similar. Practiced enough to pass a quick glance, but not to me. I set the phone down, my pulse loud in my ears. The cafe's warmth felt thinner now, its friendly noise like a curtain covering something darker. I thought about Rick's office. The pristine desk, the ready-made withdrawal slip, the way he'd pushed just enough for me to sign. This wasn't a one-time test, it was a system, one I'd almost stepped into. My coffee cooled untouched. Across the room, a young couple laughed over their pastries, oblivious to the man in the corner, realizing his own son might be stealing from him. I took a slow breath, steadying my hands. Margaret's voice came back to me, low, certain. Paper trails tell the truth when people won't. I reopened the banking app and took screenshots of every detail. Dates, amounts, signatures. Each tap of the screen felt like laying bricks in a wall between me and whatever Rick thought he could take. Somewhere in the background, a barista called out an order. Life went on, but for me, something had shifted. This wasn't about helping. It wasn't even about the money. It was about control. And now, I knew I couldn't give him any. The screenshots sat in my phone like quiet alarms. I told myself I needed time to think, time to watch, to see if the pattern would repeat. But within a week, it wasn't just the bank account that felt different. The Sunday calls, once a habit, even if they were short, stopped. Tuesday dinners at Rick's house were postponed, twice in a row. First, Emma texted about a cold going around. Then it was a last-minute client dinner. By the third week, I'd stopped expecting an invitation. The silence in my townhouse felt heavier. The radiator hissed in the corner, but the air still carried that winter chill that seeps into your bones. I tried calling one afternoon just to hear my son's voice. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. A minute later, a text arrived. Sorry, Dad. In a meeting. I'll call later. He didn't. 2 days later, I saw them in a photo on social media, Rick, Emma, and a few friends at the new steakhouse downtown. Same night he'd said he was homesick. The photo was glossy, all warm lighting and wide smiles. But to me, it was proof of something colder. They were building a life without me in it. Only Liam broke the pattern. My grandson would call after school, his voice bright, telling me about his science projects and the basketball team. Once, he asked if I could help him with a model bridge he was building. Dade says you used to design things, he said, as if the idea still amazed him. I smiled at the memory of teaching Rick how to sand wood without splinters. Sure, I told Liam. When do you want to work on it? We met that Saturday at the park near his school. The sky was pale blue, the air sharp but clean. He carried the kit in a worn backpack, proud to show me every piece. For 2 hours, we sat on a picnic table, fingers stiff in the cold, fitting beams and joints together. He listened closely, nodding like each tip was gold. When Emma came to pick him up, her smile was polite but tight. Thanks for helping him, Jonathan, she said. We've just been so busy lately. Her eyes didn't match her words. I watched them walk away, Liam turning once to wave. I waved back, tucking my hands into my coat pockets. The wind off the lake carried the smell of wood smoke from nearby homes. It should have felt comforting. Instead, it made me think of how quickly warmth can fade when people decide you're no longer needed. That night I sat in my armchair, Liam's bridge on the coffee table. Half finished. waiting for the next time he could get away to see me. If there was a next time, by mid-February, the invitations had stopped altogether. Instead, Rick began calling with requests, small on the surface, but each one chipping away at the time we used to share. "Dad, could you swing by my place to sign for a package?" "I'm tied up at work." It would mean sitting in his driveway for an hour, the key never turning in the door. Or, "We've decided to repaint the upstairs. Mind if I store some boxes in your garage?" 3 days later, half my garage was filled with his forgotten clutter. Each request came with a warm tone, as if I should be grateful for the chance to be included. But the dinners, the game nights, the easy drop-ins, they were gone. The kitchen in my townhouse began to feel unused. I still cooked. A habit is hard to break, but the meals cooled on the counter before I wrapped them for the fridge. The smell of reheated stew is not the same as the scent of a meal shared. Liam's calls became shorter. Once, he whispered, "Grandpa, Mom says I can't stay too long on the phone. Homework, you know?" But his voice told me it wasn't homework. We made a plan to finish the bridge on a Sunday. That morning, Emma texted, "Liam's got a last-minute birthday party. We'll reschedule." Reschedule never came. One afternoon, I decided to walk past their house. The snow on the sidewalks had turned to icy patches. Breath clouded in front of me. From the street, I saw through the wide living room windows Rick, Emma, and Liam on the couch watching a movie. Popcorn bowl between them. They hadn't mentioned it, not a word. I stood there longer than I should have, cold creeping into my shoes until the realization settled in my chest. This was no accident. It was arrangement. When I turned to leave, my reflection in their darkened window looked smaller than I remembered. Not just older, smaller. That night, the townhouse felt cavernous. Even the ticking clock seemed too loud. I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, letting the steam fog my glasses. Somewhere in the quiet, I thought about the bank screenshots again. The numbers dropping, invitations vanishing. Pieces of the same puzzle. The betrayal wasn't a single blow. It was erosion, grain by grain. I told myself I wouldn't confront them yet. Not until I understood the whole shape of it. But part of me knew. If it weren't for Liam, I'd already be erased. The invitation arrived in the most impersonal way possible. A mass text to friends and family about Emma's winter gathering. No direct call, no warm check-in. Just my name wedged between two of her yoga friends in a long thread. Still, I went. Curiosity outweighed dignity that night. Snow fell in lazy flakes as I pulled into their circular drive. The front windows glowed gold, laughter spilling into the night air when I opened the car door. Inside, the smell of roasted lamb and cinnamon cider wrapped around me. Coats piled high on a velvet chaise. Guests balancing wine glasses, clustered in little constellations. "Jonathan's here!" Emma's voice rose above the hum. Her smile was wide, but her eyes scanned me like a prop she'd ordered late. Come in," she said, gripping my elbow just long enough to steer me toward a group of her friends. "This is Rick's dad, the man who taught him everything, including how to avoid using a computer past 1999. A laughter rippled, the kind that lands light but leaves bruises. I forced a chuckle, but inside my jaw tightened. Rick sipped his drink across the room, watching, not intervening. The living room was staged like a magazine spread. Plush throws, candlelight catching the rim of crystal. Someone handed me a cider, too sweet, clinging to my tongue. Emma floated back, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You'll appreciate this, Jonathan. We were just talking about how brave it is to keep running those little restaurants at your age. Most folks would just retire." The pause was deliberate. Eyes turned to gauge my reaction. I took a sip, letting the warmth slide down slowly before answering. "Some folks still enjoy building things, Emma, even after 65. Her smile faltered, but only for a heartbeat. A guest nearby asked about property values. Emma jumped in. "Oh, Jonathan wouldn't know. Rick and I handle all the modern investments. He's more sentimental than strategic." The word, sentimental, landed like a pat on the head. I let my gaze wander, pretending interest in the mantel decor. That's when I saw it. A folder, half tucked under a stack of glossy design magazines. The corner poked out just enough for me to read Yollers, Harper Realty Holdings Confidential, Jas Harper. The same name on the tax statement I'd once seen in Rick's glove compartment. Not Emma's maiden name. Not anyone's I knew. Before I could move closer, Emma redirected me toward the dining table, laden with dishes that gleamed under soft light. The hum of conversation swelled. Clinking silverware, the faint hiss of the fireplace. I smiled politely, but my mind stayed with that folder. Something about it was wrong, wrong enough to etch itself into my memory. When dessert arrived, Emma made one final jab. "Wish it all toast Jonathan, for proving you can keep going, even when you're running on nostalgia." Glasses lifted. The room laughed. I raised my glass too, steady hand, steady smile. Inside, the decision formed whatever Harper Realty Holdings was, I would find out, and I'd make sure they never saw me flinch again. The hum of the party grew heavier as the night wore on. Lauder sharpened around the edges like crystal under a fingernail. Emma glided between guests, her heels clicking a rhythm that followed me no matter where I stood. I tried to settle near the fireplace, the heat licking at my hands, but she found me. "Jonathan, tell everyone about that time you mailed a letter with no stamp." Her voice dripped with mock sweetness. Gasps and giggles. They weren't laughing at the story. They were laughing at me. Rick was across the room, nursing his drink, eyes scanning the crowd as if he were keeping score. When our gazes met, he looked away. I excused myself, murmuring something about checking the coat rack. The hallway was dim, lined with framed vacation photos. Rick and Emma on beaches I'd never been invited to. The scent of pine cleaner lingered, too sharp after the spiced air of the living room. Halfway down the hall, a voice floated from the study. "Rick's, I told you, we'll have it by the end of the month." Another voice, lower, controlled. "Harper Realty can't wait that long. They want the transfer signed this week." Silence. Then Rick again. "I'm working on it. He's resistant." Emma's softening him up. My chest tightened. The folder I'd seen earlier now tethered to a deadline eye and to me. Footsteps approached. I slipped into the shadow of a tall armoire, the wood cool against my back. Rick stepped out, the man with him older, with a face you wouldn't remember if you tried. They passed without noticing. I stayed in the hall, listening to my own breathing, the faint clink of glasses from the dining room. When I returned, Emma was mid-story about how Jonathan still writes everything by hand. No wonder he takes so long to make decisions. The table laughed on cue. I sat, placing my napkin carefully across my lap, and let my eyes rest on the folder, now gone from the coffee table. Someone had moved it, or hidden it. Dessert plates clattered, coffee was poured. Through it all, I smiled when expected, nodded at small talk, but my mind replayed that single phrase. They want the transfer signed this week. As guests began to leave, Emma kissed my cheek. "So glad you could make it. We'll have to do this again soon." Her perfume clung to my jacket, long after I stepped into the cold night. Snowflakes caught in my hair as I walked to the car, each one a pinprick reminder. Time was running shorter than I'd thought. Whatever Harper Realty wanted, I had just been marked as the key. Sleep wouldn't come. The clock's red digits bled into the dark, wender in 12 m, then in 43. I lay still, the phrase looping in my mind. They want the transfer signed this week. By 200 I gave up. The house was quiet, Brooklyn quiet. A distant siren, the hum of the old radiator, the faint creak of wood shifting in the cold. I padded to my office, flipping on the lamp. Its yellow cone of light fell over neat stacks of invoices, tax forms, ledgers Margaret had kept with her careful handwriting in the margins. I opened the bottom drawer. The smell of paper and dust rose, years of our life pressed flat. I scanned for anything with the name Harper. Nothing. Receipts, bank statements, supplier contracts. All ordinary. The real storage was in the safe. Margaret had insisted on it after our second restaurant opened. Combination lock, 3 turns left, 2 right. The metal clicked loud in the stillness. Inside, a tidy row of manila folders, a small tin box, and a velvet pouch that still smelled faintly of her perfume. The third folder down caught my eye. Slightly bent at one corner, labeled in Margaret's steady script, "Harper, Property." I pulled it out, the paper warm under my hands from the safe's close quarters. Inside was a deed dated 2008. Margaret and I listed as joint owners. The property, an old brick storefront on the corner of Ash and 3rd, prime location now, but back then it had been half abandoned. No mortgage, no liens, completely ours. And at the back, a single-page letter on Harper Realty Holdings stationery. Polished logo, dense paragraphs, but one sentence stood out. "We look forward to acquiring this property when the agreed-upon terms are met." Agreed upon terms? I'd never signed anything to sell. Margaret would never have either. The date, April 2016, was months after her passing. My name typed, but the signature line blank. I sat back, the chair's leather cold against my neck. If Harper had been waiting since 2016, Rick's sudden urgency now made sense. He'd found out about this deed, and was trying to leverage me into signing. I placed the folder on the desk, its weight heavier than paper should be. The radiator hissed, as if warning me to tread carefully. From the tin box I took Margaret's old address book. her notes curled in blue ink beside each name. I found Caldwell Lawyer, with a number I hadn't dialed in years. The man had retired, but his daughter, also an attorney, had taken over the practice. I hesitated, fingers on the receiver. Too soon to call. Too many questions still unanswered. Instead, I slid the deed and the Harper letter into a fresh envelope, locking it in the top drawer of my desk. The office felt smaller, the air heavier. Somewhere out there, Harper Realty was waiting, and Rick was moving on their timetable, not mine. In the dim light, Margaret's photo on the bookshelf seemed to watch me. I could almost hear her. "Don't let them rush you, John. Not on this." I turned off the lampy and stood in the darkness, holding that thought like a shield. By morning, the envelope in my desk felt like a live wire. I made coffee strong enough to keep a dock worker awake, the bitter steam curling into the kitchen air. Margaret's mug sat in the rack. I reached for my own, hands already itching to start digging. At the computer, I typed Harper Realty Holdings into the search bar. Dozens of results filled the screen. Their website was sleek, all clean lines and smiling stock photo families, but the About Us page was thin. No founders listed, no board members, just a generic mission statement. I clicked through property listings. Most were in gentrifying neighborhoods, places where a single purchase could change the entire block's value. Then I noticed the pattern. Several had belonged to long-standing family businesses, sold off within months of a senior owner's death. The coffee cooled beside me as I cross-referenced names from old news articles with county property records. Each time, the same sequence: family turmoil, sudden transfer of ownership, Harper stepping in at a mutually agreed price. I picked up the phone and dialed Carl Benton, a retired broker I'd known since the early days. He answered on the second ring, his voice gravelly with age. "John, haven't heard your voice in a decade." "Carl, you ever deal with a firm called Harper Realty Holdings?" The pause on the line was heavy enough to make my stomach knot. "You in business with them?" "Not exactly," I said carefully. "They're circling something I own." Carl exhaled slowly. "They're trouble. Operate through shell companies, use pressure tactics on older owners. Sometimes they partner with family members to push deals through." His words hung in the air. Partner with family members. After we hung up, I called another contact, Lydia Chang, an attorney who'd handled commercial disputes. She remembered Harper well. "They have a history of targeting owners over 65, she told me. "Often someone inside the family helps them. We've had cases where the owner didn't even realize the sale was happening until it was done." I leaned back, the chair groaning under the shift of my weight. Rick's sudden generosity, the orchestrated dinner, the way Emma kept steering conversation toward succession, all of it slotted into place. Harper wasn't just waiting for a deal, they were building a trap. I opened a blank legal pad, jotting every detail: dates, names, what Carl and Lydia had said, even my memory of Rick's nervous glances at his watch. The scratch of the pen on paper felt grounding, each line another stitch in the safety net I'd need. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, its brakes squealing, the sound sharp enough to jolt me back to the present. If Rick was tied to Harper, time wasn't on my side. I slid the legal pad into the same drawer as the envelope. Then I locked it double. My reflection in the office window looked older but harder, too. Margaret used to say I could be stubborn as an oak when it mattered. This mattered. Somewhere across the river, Harper Realty Holdings thought they'd found their next quiet acquisition. Somewhere closer, my own son was holding the door open for them. Not yet, I thought. Not without a fight. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay in the dark, listening to the old wall clock tick. Each sound a reminder that time was slipping away. The ceiling above me was just a pale blur, shadows of tree branches swaying in the streetlight's glow. Cold crept up from the hardwood floor, seeping through the quilt Margaret had sewn decades ago. I closed my eyes, but her voice rose clear in memory. "Never sign anything on impulse, John. If it's a good deal today, it'll be a good deal tomorrow." I'd heard it 100 times. After real estate pitches, after 2 slick contractors, even once when Rick had wanted me to co-sign a loan. Back then I'd chalked it up to caution. Now it felt like prophecy. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed its steady note. I pictured the envelope in my desk drawer, the names, the patterns I'd uncovered. If Harper was moving, Rick wouldn't act alone. They'd have legal papers ready, maybe even a buyer waiting in the shadows. The quilt shifted as I sat up, bare feet hitting the cold floor. I padded to the kitchen, flipped on the dim light over the sink. The air smelled faintly of yesterday's coffee. Bitter, stale, familiar. I poured a glass of water. The tap squeaking like it always had, and leaned on the counter. A plan needed shape. First, lock down the bank accounts. Second, make copies of every deed, contract, and share certificate. Third, get them somewhere Rick couldn't touch. The list grew in my head like a blueprint, each step tightening the walls around what Margaret and I had built. I took the legal pad from the drawer, ran my thumb over the pages I'd filled earlier. In the margin I wrote one more line: contact LC. The initials belonged to Lewis Carter, an old friend, sharp mind, and the kind of attorney who knew how to make a problem disappear quietly. He'd been at our wedding, and Margaret had trusted him with her will. Through the window, the street lamp lit a thin sheen of frost on the mailbox. The sight made my chest tighten. Winter was coming fast, and with it, the kind of urgency you couldn't ignore. I turned off the light, leaving the kitchen in shadow. The hum of the fridge faded behind me as I headed back to bed, listening to the boards creak under my weight. Somewhere between the clock's steady ticking and the rustle of the quilt, resolve took root. Tomorrow I'd start. No warnings, no confrontation. Just quiet moves, one after the other, until the trap they'd set for me snapped shut on them instead. Morning came gray and heavy. I woke to the smell of damp air seeping through the window frame. Frost feathered the corners of the glass, and the street outside looked washed in silver light. The clock read 16:12 a.m., early enough to move without eyes on me. In the kitchen, I set the kettle on the stove, the hiss of water heating mixed with the faint creak of the old floorboards. Fresh coffee grounds released that earthy, bitter scent, filling the small space like armor. Margaret always said a good day began with a clear mind and strong coffee. I carried the mug to my desk, opened the top drawer, and pulled out the manila envelope. Inside lay the deeds, share certificates, and the original business registration papers from the first restaurant Margaret and I had opened. I laid them flat on the desk, the paper cool under my fingers. The phone felt heavier than usual in my hand as I dialed Lewis Carter's number from memory. He answered on the second ring, voice warm but sharp, edged with curiosity. "John, it's been too long." "Lewis, I need to see you. Today, and it needs to be off the record." A pause. Then, "Understood. My office, 10 o'clock. Use the back entrance." I hung up, slid the documents into a leather satchel, and added a portable scanner I'd bought years ago, but barely used. The plan was simple: scan everything at Lewis's office, store digital copies in encrypted cloud storage, then move the originals to a safety deposit box Rick didn't know existed. By 7, I'd locked the satchel and hidden it in the false bottom of Margaret's old sewing chest. It smelled faintly of cedar, a scent that clung to my hands after I closed the lid. No one would think to look there. I moved through the house, checking each window lock, then sat at the dining table to review my bank accounts online. One by one, I changed passwords to long unguessable strings and set up alerts for any withdrawal attempt. The screen's glow reflected off my coffee cup, a quiet reminder that every keystroke was another wall between me and their reach. At 9:30, I slipped on my wool coat, hat pulled low, and stepped into the cold. The air smelled of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney, sharp and clean. I took the side street toward the bus stop, less visible than calling a car. A light wind bit at my cheeks, but I welcomed it. It kept me alert. By the time I reached Lewis's building, the sun had risen just enough to cast pale gold on the frost-covered sidewalk. I used the back entrance as instructed, my footsteps muffled on the carpeted hall. Lewis was waiting in his office doorway, tie loosened, reading glasses in hand. "Let's make sure you keep what's yours," he said. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of control return. Lewis's office smelled faintly of polished mahogany and old leather. Sunlight filtered through half-drawn blinds, striping the room in warm gold. The steady tick of the wall clock measured each breath I took. He motioned me toward a heavy oak chair opposite his desk. "Let's start with what we know," he said, pulling a yellow legal pad closer. I placed the satchel on the desk, unzipped it slowly, and spread the documents out between us. Lewis adjusted his reading glasses, scanning each page with deliberate care. "These are the originals," he confirmed. "Deeds, share certificates, the business licenses, everything Margaret and I had built over 4 decades. Seeing them here, in the hands of someone I trusted, brought a brief flicker of relief. He began listing steps in his clipped, methodical tone. "First, we'll file an immediate freeze on any power of attorney changes. Second, I'll draft a security clause for your accounts. No transactions without in-person verification. Third, we'll move your property deeds into a trust that only you can dissolve." The scratch of his pen on paper sounded steady, like a craftsman shaping something meant to last. I sipped the coffee he'd handed me, strong, slightly bitter, and watched the steam curl in the sunlight. Margaret would have liked Louis. He spoke little, listened well, and didn't waste words on false comfort. What about proof? I asked. They won't stop just because we've locked a few doors. Louis nodded. Proof is key. We'll gather statements, bank logs, and anything showing their intent. If we can connect them to a coordinated plan, especially involving a controlled substance, we'll have grounds for both civil and criminal protection. The word, criminal, hung in the air, heavier than the oak desk between us. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, anger edged with sorrow. My own son, I said quietly. Louis met my gaze without flinching. I've seen worse betrayals. John, family doesn't always mean loyalty. We moved on to the financial map. He circled certain accounts in red ink, marking them as high risk for unauthorized access. Close these today, he instructed. Transfer the balances to a new institution, preferably one outside their immediate knowledge. His pen tapped a line of figures. This one. Your joint account with Margaret. We'll treat with extra caution. It's sentimentally valuable, and people like Rick will exploit that. The clock ticked louder in the pause that followed. Outside, a car horn blared, muted by the thick windows. I thought about the night Rick was born. How small his fingers had been, how certain I'd been that my job was to protect him. Now my job was to protect myself from him. Louis leaned back, steepling his fingers. John, you have leverage. Your businesses, your name, your reputation. All of it is stronger than their desperation. If we move quietly, we can cut them off without them realizing until it's too late. For this confidence steadied me. For the first time in weeks, I felt the ground under my feet. Let's begin, I said. And we did, sorting, signing, sealing, turning paper and ink into a shield. By late afternoon, the plan had moved from paper to action. Louis and I walked side by side into the downtown bank. The air inside was cool and faintly metallic, like every institution built to guard money. Marble floors echoed under our steps, and the low murmur of customers faded as we approached the counter. The branch manager, a trim woman in a navy suit, looked up from her desk when Louis introduced me. Mr. Miller will need to close several accounts today, he said in that steady, measured voice that made people listen. Her smile was professional but curious. Of course. Let's bring you into my office. Behind the glass door, I handed over the first set of account numbers. She keyed them in, the quiet tapping of her keyboard like a countdown clock. When she turned the monitor toward me, I saw balances Margaret and I had built through years of early mornings and late nights. Close these completely, I said. Her eyes flicked to Louis, who nodded once. Within minutes, she printed withdrawal slips, each page sliding from the printer warm to the touch. Next came the joint account with Margaret's name. I hesitated, the cursor blinking on the screen, like it was waiting for my permission to erase part of our history. Louis leaned closer. Transferring it isn't erasing her, John. It's protecting what you two built. I exhaled slowly. All right. Move it to the new trust. We signed the trust documents in a small conference room that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. The pen felt heavy in my hand, not from its weight, but from the meaning behind each stroke. With every signature, I was taking the keys out of Rick and Emma's hands without them even knowing. From the bank, Louis drove us to a smaller, quieter branch of an institution Rick had never dealt with. The carpet muffled our steps, and a young teller greeted us with the easy warmth of someone who didn't yet know the stakes. I opened new accounts, placed them under the trust's name, and arranged for statements to be sent only to Louis's office. By the time we stepped back into the cooling evening, the sky over the city was painted in soft orange and purple. We walked a block in silence, the sound of traffic mixing with the distant call of a street vendor. At Louis's car, he handed me a small folder. Everything we did today is in here. Keep it with you until I finish the final security clauses. The folder was warm from his hand, but solid in a way that made my chest unclench. John, he said, pausing before opening the door, you're not just defending yourself. You're making sure Margaret's legacy isn't rewritten by their greed. The words stayed with me on the ride home. When I stepped into my living room, the late sun caught the photograph of Margaret on the mantel. Her smile seemed different now, a less wistful, more approving. I set the folder beside her picture, a quiet promise that I was keeping what we'd built safe. For the first time in weeks, the air in the house felt lighter. Control was mine again. The morning light was sharp, cutting through the blinds in narrow blades. It felt like a signal, time to move. I started with the locks, The locksmith arrived at exactly 8, his toolbox clinking softly as he stepped inside. New keys, new deadbolts. I told him. He didn't ask why. The rhythmic sound of metal against metal was almost calming. Each turn of his wrench meant Rick and Emma had one less way back in. While he worked, I called Lewis. All systems go, I said. His voice was steady. Bank transfers processed overnight. We'll finalize the property titles today. I could hear papers shuffling in the background, a sound that now meant security. Next was the staff call. I dialed my restaurant managers one by one. The scent of fresh coffee filled the kitchen as I told each of them. If anyone other than me or Lewis asks about financials or access, you refuse. No exceptions. Most replied with a simple, "Understood, sir." But I caught a pause in Maria's voice. "They're going to be angry," she said quietly. "That's not my concern anymore," I answered. By 10, the locksmith handed me 3 identical keys. Cool metal, smooth edges, they fit perfectly into my palm. I slid one into my pocket, another into a desk drawer, and kept the last for Lewis. At Lewis's office downtown, the hum of the copier filled the air as we signed the property transfer forms. The deeds slid into a manila envelope, the paper still warm from the printer. "These are recorded immediately," Lewis said, handing them to his assistant. "No one can contest them without a fight." I thought of Rick's face, when he'd find out the houses, the shares, even the beach cabin were no longer reachable. It was a bitter image but not satisfying, just necessary. Back home I unplugged the landline. It was a relic, but one Rick always used to bypass my cell. The silence after the click felt like closing a door for good. By noon, the checklist was almost complete: new locks, frozen access, titles secured, accounts shifted. I sat at the dining table, the same spot where Margaret and I had once planned vacations and Sunday dinners. Now, it was my war room. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past. The day looked ordinary, but every move I'd made was changing the ground under Rick and Emma's feet. They didn't know it yet, but by sundown, the old life they'd counted on would be gone. I picked up the last envelope, a set of certified letters to be delivered to them tomorrow. Inside, legal notices confirming their access was revoked, effective immediately. The one-day cutoff had begun. The courthouse lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. I walked past the security scanner, my briefcase heavier than usual. Inside were contracts, leases, and partnership agreements. All the threads Rick could have pulled if I'd left them loose. At the clerk's counter, I slid the documents across the glass. "File these today. Priority processing." The clerk's pen scratched quickly over the intake forms. The sound was sharp, final. Stamp after stamp came down, each one like a nail in a closing door. Outside, the air felt cooler, but the clock in my head was ticking louder. By now, Rick might have checked one of the accounts and found it frozen. I needed to stay 3 steps ahead. Back at Luce's office, we called the vendors, suppliers for my restaurants, maintenance crews for properties, the security company for the warehouses. "Authorization is mine only," I told each one. "No verbal or written orders from anyone else are valid." Some asked why, most just took notes. One manager lowered his voice. "I thought your son had partial control." "Not anymore," I said, feeling the weight of those words settle in the room. We worked through the afternoon, signing digital orders, canceling old access codes, and issuing new ones. The clack of Luce's keyboard and the low hum of my phone's speaker became the soundtrack to this quiet siege. At 3, Maria called from the restaurant floor. "They were here," she said. Her voice carried that quick, clipped edge people get when adrenaline spikes. "They asked about the books, wanted to see last quarter's statements." I told them nothing, just like you said. A knot tightened in my chest. "They'll try again," I told her. "Keep the staff close. No one talks." By late afternoon, the sunlight was dimming, casting long shadows across Lewis's office. I could feel the day slipping away, but the checklist was nearly complete. Contracts locked, vendors briefed, security protocols changed. I signed the last batch of letters, termination notices for joint accounts, and a formal revocation of any powers Rick had tried to claim. The paper smelled faintly of ink and adhesive, a mundane scent for such decisive action. As Lewis sealed the envelopes, I caught my reflection in the office window. The face looking back wasn't triumphant. It was steady set, and a little older than it had been this morning. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I was doing it because Margaret would have told me. There's a line you can't let your own blood cross. We turned off the office lights. Outside, the city's evening traffic pulsed with urgency, horns and engines merging into a steady roar. I stepped into it knowing tomorrow Rick and Emma's world would look nothing like today's. The office phone rang just as Louis was sliding the last envelope into the courier bag. Not the main line, my personal cell. The number flashing on the screen was one I'd known since Rick was in high school. I let it ring twice before answering. Dad, his voice came fast. Clip. What the hell is going on? Every account I tried today is locked. Vendors won't take my calls. Even the building security says I'm not authorized. He paused, breath ragged. You did this? I glanced at Louis, who kept his eyes on the paperwork, giving me the privacy of silence. I made sure everything Margaret and I built is protected, I said evenly. Protected from bad decisions and worse intentions. Rick laughed, sharp and humorless. Bad decisions. You don't know what's coming. You think you've bought yourself safety, but you've just signed my death warrant. There it was, the leverage, the guilt, the manipulation. He'd used it before. It didn't sting the same now. You owe people money, I said. That's on you. You don't solve a problem like that by destroying your own family. I am your family. The shout cracked, breaking under its own weight. I'm your only son. I let the words hang there. The hum of the city seeped through the window glass, a muted reminder that life outside this call was moving on, indifferent to our wreckage. You made choices, I said at last. And today, I made mine. His voice dropped, cold now. You'll regret this. Maybe, I said, but I'll regret it less than signing away my life's work. And then I ended the call. For a moment, the quiet in Louis's office felt like a vacuum. No phones, no keyboards, just the faint tick of the wall clock. The kind of silence that follows a door closing for good. I slipped the phone into my jacket pocket. Couriers waiting, Louis reminded me gently. We handed over the sealed bag, each envelope inside a lock on a door Rick would never open again. On the sidewalk, the evening air carried the smell of street food, grilled onions, roasted chestnuts from a vendor's cart. Normal life, ordinary and untouched by the storm I'd just stepped out of. I walked toward my car, feeling both lighter and more aware of the weight that still lingered. The accounts were safe, the contracts locked. But the look in Rick's voice, the mix of desperation and threat, told me this wasn't finished. Under the street lamp, I took out my wallet and touched the worn photo of Margaret. You'd have done the same, I murmured. Then I slid behind the wheel, engine rumbling to life, and drove into a night that felt both safer and more uncertain than ever. The morning after felt almost unnaturally quiet. No buzzing phone, no pounding on the door, no veiled messages from mutual contacts. Rick and Emma had vanished from the immediate horizon, their silence stretching long enough to feel deliberate. I made coffee the way Margaret liked it, 2 scoops, a splash of cream before the pour, never after. The aroma drifted through the kitchen, pulling me back to mornings when the day's biggest decision was whether to read the paper at the table or in the den. The knock that came was soft, almost hesitant. When I opened the door, it wasn't Rick or Emma. It was the courier, this time bringing documents from my attorney. I signed for the envelope and brought it inside, slicing it open with the same care I'd use on a family letter. Inside were updated ownership records, new legal protections locking down every asset. A cover note from my lawyer read, all accounts and properties are now insulated from any unauthorized claims. Stay alert. They may try indirect routes. I set the papers beside my coffee and sat for a long moment, hands wrapped around the warm mug. The quiet was different from before, less like loneliness, more like a calm I'd earned. Around noon, my phone rang. Emily's name lit up the screen. Grandpa, she said, her voice a balm I didn't know I needed. I heard about everything. I'm so sorry. Her pause was thick with the weight of things she wasn't saying. I don't agree with them. I want you to know that. I exhaled slowly. Thank you, Emily. That means more than you realize. We talked about small things at first. Her classes, the coffee shop she'd started working at part-time. Then, quieter, she asked, "Are you safe?" "I am," I told her. "And I'm making sure it stays that way." After we hung up, I sat back and let her words linger. One person still reaching out. It was enough to remind me that family wasn't always defined by the loudest voices at the table. That afternoon, I went to my lawyer's office in person. The city streets bustled with people carrying lunch bags, delivery bikes weaving between cars, a world oblivious to the private battles fought in quiet offices. Inside, the conference room smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh paper. My lawyer reviewed each document with me, explaining how every clause now ensured Rick and Emma couldn't touch what wasn't theirs. We signed, sealed, and filed. With each pen stroke, the tension in my shoulders eased. Walking back to my car, I passed a bakery. Through the glass, a tray of fresh cinnamon rolls steamed in the afternoon light. Margaret used to say the smell of cinnamon could turn any day around. I bought two, one for now, one for tomorrow, and stepped back into the street with the small paper bag warming my hands. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was reacting to someone else's moves. The board was mine to play. The decision to leave the house had been building quietly, like a tide that rises so slowly you don't notice until it's at your feet. By the end of the week, I knew it was time. I started in the study. The shelves still held decades of our life. Margaret's gardening books, my ledgers, and a row of photo albums with cracked leather spines. I ran my hand along the dust, pulling out one at random. Inside, snapshots from our first restaurant opening, faces flushed with pride and exhaustion. I smiled, then closed it carefully and set it in the take pile. Some choices were harder. Margaret's winter coat hung in the hall closet, still smelling faintly of cedar and the perfume she wore on Sundays. I held it for a long time before deciding it belonged with Emily. She had her grandmother's build and, more importantly, her warmth. When Emily arrived that afternoon, she stepped in from the cold, her cheeks pink, her scarf loose around her neck. "I have something for you," I told her, handing over the coat. She pressed it to her chest. "It smells like her," she whispered. I nodded, not trusting my voice. We worked together for hours, packing dishes into boxes, sorting the framed photographs. Some went into storage, others she took with her to keep them in the family. As she said, the air was filled with the muted thump of boxes closing and the rip of packing tape. By early evening, the living room was a landscape of stacks, things to keep, things to store, things to give away. The walls looked bare without the pictures, their outlines faint in the fading light. I made us tea in the kitchen, the kettle whistling sharp against the quiet. We sat at the small table, steam curling between us. Emily asked, "Do you know where you'll go?" "Somewhere quieter," I said. "Somewhere mine." The answer felt solid, like the first brick in a new foundation. After she left, I stood in the doorway, watching her walk down the snowy path. The porch light caught the edge of Margaret's coat as Emily pulled it tighter around herself. Back inside, I finished labeling the last box. The sound of the marker squeaking over cardboard was strangely final. I stacked it with the others near the door, ready for the moving truck in the morning. In the empty space where the sofa had been, I could hear the house differently. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional pop of the heating pipes. It wasn't loneliness I felt, but a kind of clarity. This house had been the stage for my life with Margaret and the battleground for my fight with Rick and Emma. Now it would belong to someone else. I locked the front door, slid the new key into my pocket, and turned off the lights. Tomorrow I'd drive toward a place where the air was clean, the days were mine to shape, and the past could sit quietly on a shelf instead of at my table. The cabin was smaller than the old house, but it breathed in a way the city never had. From the front porch, I could see the lake stretching wide and still, morning mist curling off the surface like slow, moving smoke. The first night I slept with the windows cracked. The air was cool, edged with the scent of pine and the faint mineral tang of fresh water. Instead of traffic or sirens, I woke to the rustle of wind in the trees and the low call of a loon somewhere across the water. By the second morning, I'd found the rhythm here. Coffee on the porch as the sun broke over the far ridge, then a walk down the gravel path to the small dock. The boards creaked under my weight, and minnows flickered like quicksilver just beneath the surface. It was quiet, but not empty. The kind of quiet that let your thoughts stretch without breaking. The locals were friendly in a measured way. At the general store, a woman named Ruth rang up my groceries ear and asked if I was the new man in the cabin by Miller's Cove. When I nodded, she smiled like she'd just confirmed a rumor and told me about the Friday fish fry at the fire hall. In the afternoons, I unpacked slowly. Only the essentials, leaving boxes of old life sealed for now. Margaret's photograph went on the mantel, her smile catching the same soft light that poured through the window at dusk. The coat hooks by the door stayed mostly empty, save for my jacket and the scarf Emily had knitted for me last winter. One evening, I took the rowboat out onto the lake. The oars dipped in and out of the water with a soft, rhythmic splash, sending ripples toward the shore. Halfway across, I stopped rowing and just let the boat drift. The sky was streaked in gold and lavender, the air cooling against my skin. I thought about the last few months. The chaos, the choices, the clean breaks, and felt something close to peace settle in my chest. This place didn't erase the past. It didn't need to. It simply made room for the parts of me that had been buried under noise and suspicion. Here I could breathe without glancing over my shoulder. It started with one bookshelf. I'd been stacking my old books in neat piles along the cabin wall, unsure what to do with them all. Emily, visiting for the weekend, ran her fingers along the spines and smiled in that way she had when a plan was forming. "You should share these," she said simply. "With the town. With the kids. Half of them probably don't have a place to read outside of school." 2 weeks later, the empty corner of the fire hall had become a small reading nook. We carried in mismatched chairs from yard sales, a rug Ruth donated from her basement, and the first 3 shelves, built by a retired carpenter who refused payment. The townsfolk brought their own contributions: dog-eared mysteries, cookbooks with penciled notes, classic novels with names scrawled on the inside covers. Opening day was modest, maybe a dozen people, but they lingered. A young boy sat cross-legged with a picture book about trains. An older man leafed through a gardening guide, while his wife picked up a memoir she'd been meaning to read. I made coffee in the corner and watched strangers talk like neighbors. Emily handled the catalog system with the care of a librarian, teaching local teenagers how to check books in and out. When I asked why she was giving up her Saturday afternoons, she shrugged. "Because you're building something that matters, and I want to be part of it." By the end of the month, the reading nook had grown into the Cove Library, a name someone painted on a wooden sign that hung over the entrance. We hosted a Thursday story hour for children and a Saturday discussion circle for anyone who wanted to share. The fire hall's once empty corner now smelled faintly of paper and coffee, a scent that felt like home. One night, after locking up, I stood in the doorway and looked at the rows of books, the donated chairs, the bulletin board crowded with thank you notes. None of it was fancy, but it was built on trust, the kind that couldn't be stolen or signed away, the kind that grew stronger each time someone walked in the door. Margaret would have loved it. She believed in leaving a place better than you found it. As I switched off the lights, I felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing I was doing just that, not with money, not with grand gestures, but with shelves, stories, and a room where everyone was welcome. The last light over the lake felt like it was meant just for me. I'd taken back my life not with noise but with quiet, steady hands. If you've ever found your strength in silence, share your story below. You are not alone. Every ending can be a new beginning.